Most atheists, if not all, imagine that belief in God is based on an ignorance intended to fill in the gaps of those scientific frontiers which remain unexplored. Such gaps, however, will probably, the atheists suppose, some do, some don't, will supposedly be eventually filled in by science, and so as August mentioned, lightning was thought by primitive people to be the raging of the gods, tidal waves are caused by Poseidon, wars by Ares, and we know better. Firstly, I'd like to note that such thinking is simply a masked version of the philosophy of positivism, which presupposes that science is everything. Science has the intrinsic ability to unlock all of life's mysteries. Science and the scientific method becomes the only valid form of inquiry, which immediately tells us that lurking beneath this argument is a rather extreme and totally unexamined epistemological theory. Try putting this type of epistemology to work in a marriage. Try putting it to work in your friendships with other people. That the only way you can know for sure whether or not your beloved also considers you as their beloved is through some scientific means. You will fail in the most important areas of life, in the things that really count. So, this entire argument is a way of stacking the deck and rigging the dice and smuggling the whole thing in. It's a philosophical enormity. And the fact of the matter is, those of you familiar with the academy today in the study of philosophy, very few professional philosophers actually hold to positivism anymore, along with its close cousin, verificationism, wherein all truth claims must conform to an empirical process or be self-evident. Folks, think about that. The very claim empiricism is true, or that everything must be verified through empirical evidence using the five senses, or must be self-evident, itself cannot yield to that truth-finding mechanism. Itself is self-referentially absurd because it can't meet the standards of its own test for being true. It's simply claimed. It's like saying I can't speak a word of English. This form of philosophical epistemology, made most famous in the infamous Vienna Circle, they admitted the failure of this enterprise decades ago. But of course, this doesn't still answer the God of the Gaps objection. It's often been said that atheism is parasitic on bad theology. That's the case with this argument. This argument for atheism is parasitic on bad theology. This isn't to pick on August, per se, but in many ways actually really to sympathize and give his argument some credence, that due to this proliferation of bad theology, often from Christian apologists themselves, it leaves the belief in God wide open to the charge of a false invocation when attempting to explain various phenomena. So it'd be like me saying, there's a strange knock in my car, I'm driving down the street. Oh, you know what it must be? It must be some invisible, gangly little homunculus lurking around in there causing mischief, poking things in my car. That's what's causing the engine trouble. The problem, though, folks, is that classical theism, at least Christian theism, has never made claims like that. And with regard to God, it has never been about invoking God. Please listen to me carefully. It has never been about invoking God as a scientific mechanism for any particular natural or empirical phenomenon. I realize we hear this stuff all the time, for example, from the intelligent design movement, and August and I could probably stand side by side here and offer our critiques of that movement. That's going to get me in trouble with some people, I realize. A point of agreement of August and mine is that the intelligent design movement commits the God of the Gaps fallacy. So August and I do share something in common more than just the air we breathe. It's bad theology, it's bad not going to continue on anymore, I don't think, with the God of the Gaps thing, except to mention that I know people may have some questions about some of the things I've said about it, but we can get to those later if you want. But I do want to note for you that this term God of the Gaps, the term itself was coined not by an atheist or an agnostic, but actually by a Christian thinker, again at Oxford, as a rejoinder to this faulty kind of vision. The issue goes further back. It has to do with Isaac Newton, who studied planetary orbits, diurnal rotations, and whatnot. And basically, Newton could figure out the math for certain planetary orbitations, but there was an anomaly in it. And so Newton said, well, at that point, the finger of God must come down. You know, God takes care of that part, but nature takes care of the rest. So you have nature over here, God over here. It's God of gaps. The part Newton couldn't explain with God. And of course, about 50 or 100 years later, somebody did explain scientifically and mathematically what that astronomical perturbation was, what the explanation for it was. Charles Alfred Coulson, not Charles Coulson, the one of, but Charles Alfred Coulson was a mathematician at Oxford and a Christian. He coined this term, God of the Gaps, not to show that God is losing ground to the natural sciences, but to help us avoid wrong thinking in science and in theism by saying that God does some stuff while nature does the rest of the stuff. Coulson knew that religion and science are two alternative approaches to seeking certain kinds of truths. Each is suited in its own way to different sets of questions. They're not irreconcilable, but complementary. Faith and reason, science and Christianity are complementary. There is no divide. It is a ruse. It is a mythology of our day that these are at war with one another. So, what we have here is a problem not between science and theism at all, but in mistaken views of both of them. Can I have a time check? Oh, it's been 20. Okay. Well, I'll just keep on cutting into my time and go over. Unless you start throwing things at me or something, then I'll stop. Okay. This brings us back to a notion of a workable epistemology. There are many epistemologies. One of them, as I alluded to, is known as empiricism. Now, at the risk of being oversimplistic, empiricism, as I alluded to, is essentially the view that the only valid truth-finding mechanism in the world is that which can subject itself to either the scientific method or to our senses, our five senses. And I think the base from which many atheists operate is a brute, unqualified empiricism. Let me paint a little picture for you, actually kind of a double picture. Take this kind of crass empiricism and put it on one side. Imagine two big pillars up here. If I had a whiteboard or something, big pillars. And over on this side, we have this kind of brute, crass empiricism at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we have what we might call an irrational mysticism. Just a really floaty, warm kind of diaphanous bath that you just sort of... and you just let your mind float around your spirit soar, and maybe you try astral projection or something. So put these two things at these two opposite poles. I see many atheists standing at that one end of the extreme spectrum, the spectrum of brute empiricism. Now imagine you're looking at the famous Roman tile mosaic of Ulysses. It's a beautiful piece in the Bardo Museum in Tunisia. The atheist, it seems to me, is like an observer who has his eye pressed right up against the wall and is looking at only one tile, or one tile at a time. And he or she wants a scientific explanation for that one tile in the mosaic. That's your brute empiricism. The irrational mystic, on the other hand, is standing so far away from the mosaic that it's little more than a blur, such that he can interpret it in pretty much any way he wants. Now, to me, the critical realist which is a much more reasonable epistemological view, will stand somewhere between these two extreme poles and can appreciate the details of the mosaic while also relating those details to the whole. So what we must do in a debate like this, which of its nature is a philosophical debate, is make a transition from the empirical to the theoretical. We are looking for an explanation. How do we, it's the ancient problem of the Greeks that the Greeks sought to answer. The problem of the one and the many. The problem of the universe. One verse diversity. A university literally means diversity in one. A unity of diversity. That's what we're seeking to do when we examine a philosophical worldview. When we consider the existence of God, what we need to do is we need to ask, there's a number of ways this can be approached, but this is just one I'm suggesting tonight. We need to ask what the probability is of various strands of evidence, that is, those often used to point to God, still existing if in fact God did not exist. Purposely tonight, I have not offered the classical arguments for the existence of God, because you can go and get them on Google. They're important, and they're valid, important arguments, and I think you should look them up. They're the cosmological argument, the axiological argument, the teleological argument, and the ontological argument. You can remember them by the acronym CATO or TACO. Pick one. I would recommend CATO because CATO makes you think of the Thinking Institute, TACO makes you hungry. But when we consider the four main branches of philosophy, for example, metaphysics, ethics, epistemology, aesthetics, logic, it emerges that each of these vital pursuits are ultimately robbed of any substance on an atheistic worldview. In order to work at all, they must be deeply rooted in the ironic presumption of theism. The study of knowledge, epistemology, becomes utterly futile on an atheistic understanding because it implies physical materialism. The idea that nothing exists except matter and energy and their interchangeability. But physical materialism destroys the objective validity of propositions because it fundamentally divorces knowledge from reality. It puts an impassable chasm between epistemology and ontology, the study of being. If physicalism is true, as atheism demands it be, then the difference between propositions made by an atheist and that of a theist reduces to the manner in which the atoms and chemicals in our brains fizzle out. What you're hearing tonight is brain gas. The great psychologist William James recognized this problem, saying that if the atheist is correct, quote, scientific theories themselves, if the atheist is correct, scientific theories themselves are organically conditioned just as much as religious emotions are. And if we only knew the facts intimately enough, we should doubtless see the human liver determining the dicta of the sturdy atheist as decisively as it does those of the Methodist under conviction, anxious about his soul. When it alters in one way the blood that percolates it, we get the Methodist. When it alters it in another way, we get the atheist form of life. Now, the last thing I want to offer to you is just to ponder this, okay? Instead of something fancy like the ontological argument, I call this the stranger-stranger argument. There are those, I suppose, who have never shuddered at the strangeness of their own existence and the cosmos around them. And yet, without some apprehension of the strangeness of our existence, the strangeness that we're here, that we're alive and breathing and partaking in this event, the strangeness of it all, that we're alive here. Without some apprehension of that strangeness, one cannot even begin to engage in serious contemplation of anything at all.